A rich man decided to thank an orphan and hired her to take care of his daughter. Upon returning home, he was petrified when he saw what the orphan had done to his daughter. The flames danced menacingly against the night sky, consuming the Wilson mansion with terrifying speed. Thick black smoke billowed from the windows, turning the once pristine white walls into a canvas of orange and grey. The crackling of burning wood mixed with desperate screams pierced the peaceful suburban night. Through the front door, stumbling and coughing, emerged Michelle Carter, her clothes singed and hair partially burned. In her arms she clutched 7-year-old Melissa Wilson, the child's limp body pressed protectively against her chest. Michelle's face was streaked with soot, her eyes wide with terror, but her grip on Melissa never wavered. "Help! Someone please help!" Michelle's voice, hoarse from smoke inhalation, carried across the gathering crowd of neighbors. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she refused to fall, not while Melissa needed her. James Wilson's black Mercedes screeched to a halt in front of the burning house, his heart stopping at the sight before him. He had left work early, driven by an inexplicable sense of unease, only to find his worst nightmares manifesting. Melissa. Oh God, Michelle. He ran toward them as Michelle's strength finally gave out. She fell to her knees but managed to keep Melissa cradled safely. James reached them just as Michelle whispered she's breathing. "I got her out in time," before collapsing herself. From the crowd, Margaret Reynolds, the housekeeper who had raised doubts about Michelle from the start, watched in shocked silence. Her hands covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the very person she had distrusted risk everything to save Melissa. Sirens wailed in the distance as emergency vehicles approached. The gathered neighbors, many of whom had shunned Michelle based on rumors and prejudice, stood in stunned silence. The same girl they had whispered about, avoided, and judged was now lying unconscious on the lawn, having proved her character in the most profound way possible. James knelt between Michelle and Melissa, one hand on each of them, his world narrowed to these two precious lives. "Stay with me, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "Both of you, stay with me." The flames continued their relentless assault on the mansion, but in that moment as paramedics rushed forward and neighbors finally moved to help, something far more important than a house was being saved. A family, forged not by blood but by love and sacrifice, was fighting to survive. This night would change everything, but none of them yet knew just how deep those changes would go. If this dramatic opening has touched your heart and left you eager for more, join our storytelling family by subscribing. Together, we'll explore more powerful tales of love, sacrifice, and redemption that will move your soul and inspire your spirit. James Wilson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his executive office on the 32nd floor of Wilson Enterprises, his reflection ghosting against the Austin skyline. At 42, he cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that only enhanced his authoritative presence, but his steel blue eyes, usually sharp with determination, now held a familiar shadow of loneliness. 5 years had passed since the accident that took Sarah, his wife and soulmate, leaving him to raise their 2-year-old daughter alone. The memory of that rainy night still haunted him. Sarah's quick trip to the pharmacy for Melissa's fever medicine, the police officer at his door 2 hours later, the world shattering with 3 simple words, "There's been an accident." James's fingers brushed against the silver frame on his desk, a photo of Sarah holding baby Melissa, both laughing at something beyond the camera's view. Sarah's golden hair caught the sunlight, her green eyes sparkling with joy. It was the last family photo they'd taken, just a week before the accident. "I'm trying, love," he whispered to the photograph, a daily ritual that brought both comfort and pain. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm enough for her." Despite his success in the business world, building Wilson Enterprises from a small consulting firm into a Fortune 500 company, James felt like an amateur in the most important role of his life, being a father. Board meetings and multinational negotiations seemed simple compared to answering Melissa's innocent questions about why her mother wasn't coming home. The company demanded more of his time than ever, leaving Melissa in the care of Margaret Reynolds, their longtime housekeeper. Margaret was efficient, loyal, and loving towards Melissa, but James knew his daughter needed more. He saw it in her eyes when he missed another school play, in her forced smile when he had to cancel their weekend plans for an emergency meeting. His office phone buzzed, his assistant's voice reminding him of the board meeting in 5 minutes. James straightened his tie, a gesture so automatic it had become almost compulsive. Control, that's what the gesture was about. In a world where he couldn't control the most important things, like keeping his wife alive or being the father Melissa deserved, he clung to what he could control. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him as he gathered his papers. Wilson Enterprises employed thousands, their livelihoods depending on his decisions. The pressure to maintain Sarah's memory, to give Melissa the life she deserved, to lead his company, sometimes it felt like drowning in slow motion. Walking through the office, James nodded to his employees, maintaining the confident facade they expected from their CEO. None of them saw the nights he spent poring over parenting books, the mornings he practiced conversation topics for Melissa's age group, the weekends he researched activities that might interest a 7-year-old girl. In his private elevator, James allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. "I need help," Sarah, he admitted to the empty space. "Melissa needs more than I can give her alone." He thought of the child therapist's recent suggestion that Melissa needed a consistent female presence in her life, someone who could bridge the gap between a housekeeper and a mother figure. The elevator doors opened to the boardroom level, and James Wilson, CEO, stepped out shoulders back, expression composed, every inch the successful businessman. But inside, James Wilson, father, continued his endless search for ways to give his daughter the love and support she needed. Little did he know that fate was about to answer his prayers in the most unexpected way, through a chance encounter that would change not only his and Melissa's lives, but would unravel secrets that had been buried for decades. As he pushed open the boardroom doors, the day's most significant moment wasn't waiting in that meeting, it was waiting on a street corner, where destiny had positioned a brave young woman named Michelle Carter. This segment of our story sets the stage for the remarkable events to follow. The struggles of a widowed father, the weight of responsibility, and the deep longing for something more are about to collide with circumstances that will test everything James thinks he knows about family, trust, and love. In the early morning light, Michelle Carter scrubbed another car in the parking lot of Austin's business district, her hands raw from the harsh soap and cold water. At 22, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her worn clothes and calloused hands. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing striking green eyes that held both wisdom and wariness, eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. The St. Mary's Orphanage sign still cast long shadows in her memories. 18 years of watching other children leave with their new families, while she remained behind, branded by a false accusation that followed her like a persistent ghost. At age 12, she had been accused of stealing the headmistress's prized antique locket, a crime she didn't commit. Despite her tearful denials, the incident became a dark mark in her file, causing potential adoptive parents to hesitate and ultimately choose other children. "You just have to work harder to prove yourself," Michelle whispered, repeating the mantra that had kept her going through years of disappointment. The memory of her last day at the orphanage still burned fresh, standing at the gates with nothing but a small backpack containing all her worldly possessions, 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of Jane Eyre, and her most treasured possession, a delicate embroidered handkerchief, the only item she had from her biological mother. The handkerchief bore the initials SW and a small embroidered butterfly, its colors still vibrant despite the years. Michelle often wondered about those initials, about the woman who had left her at the orphanage steps with nothing but this single connection to her past. The social workers had found no trace of her parents, no clue to her history beyond a note stating her name and date of birth. As she moved to the next car, Michelle reflected on her current life. After leaving the orphanage, she had worked any job she could find: dishwasher, grocery bagger, cleaning service. Now, she had built a small but steady clientele of car washing customers in the business district. Some days she made enough to afford both dinner and the rent for her tiny studio apartment in the rougher part of town. A group of well-dressed business people walked past, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Michelle was used to being invisible to people like them, yet she noticed everything: the way they carried themselves, spoke, dressed. She studied them like textbooks, teaching herself to blend in when necessary, determined that one day she would rise above her circumstances. At night, Michelle attended community college classes, paying her way one course at a time. Her dream of becoming a child psychologist seemed distant, but each small step brought her closer. She wanted to help children like herself, to be the advocate she never had. The professors praised her insight and determination, unaware that her understanding came from living the cases they discussed in class. The small birthmark on her left wrist, shaped like a crescent moon, was her other connection to her unknown past. Sometimes she traced its outline, imagining it as a sign of belonging to someone, somewhere. The social workers had noted it in her file, hoping it might help identify her family, but like everything else about her origins, it remained a mystery. Despite the hardships, Michelle had never lost her capacity for kindness. She volunteered at local children's shelters when she could, sharing stories and hope with kids who reminded her of herself. "Your past doesn't define your future," she would tell them, words she struggled to believe for herself some days. The morning sun climbed higher as Michelle finished another car, her reflection ghosting across its polished surface. In it, she caught a glimpse of herself, tired but unbowed, solitary but not defeated. She had survived the whispers of the orphanage, the nights of crying silently in her bed, the crushing disappointment of watching family after family after family choose someone else. Those experiences had built something unbreakable in her spirit. Little did she know that fate was about to intervene in the most unexpected way. As she gathered her supplies to move to the next car, the universe was aligning to bring her face to face with a moment that would change everything. A chance encounter was about to connect her with the answers she had spent a lifetime seeking, though the path to those answers would test every ounce of strength and courage she possessed. Sarah Wilson's presence lingered in every corner of the Wilson mansion, though she had been gone for 5 years. Her portrait hung in the main hallway, a stunning woman with flowing golden hair and vibrant green eyes that seemed to follow visitors through the house. In it, she wore a cream-colored dress, her hand resting on her swollen belly, pregnant with Melissa at the time. The same green eyes that now haunted Michelle Carter's reflection, though nobody had yet made the connection. Before her marriage to James, Sarah Elizabeth Winchester had been a rising star in pediatric medicine, known for her exceptional empathy with young patients and their families. Her colleagues at Austin Children's Hospital still spoke of her with reverence, the doctor who would sit for hours with frightened children, telling them stories until their fears subsided. What few knew was that her dedication to children stemmed from a deep personal wound, the loss of her baby sister. Sarah had been only 6 when her parents brought home little Emily, a bright-eyed baby with a distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark on her left wrist. For 2 years, Sarah had been the proudest big sister, teaching Emily her first words, holding her hand as she took her first steps. Then came the night that shattered their family, a house fire that claimed their parents' lives and separated the sisters forever. In the chaos of the foster system, Emily disappeared. Sarah, taken in by her maternal aunt, spent years searching for her sister. Even after marrying James and building a new life, she never stopped looking. Every birthday, she would light 2 candles, one for her lost parents and one for Emily, wondering if somewhere out there, her sister was doing the same. The irony of fate was cruel. Sarah had dedicated her life to helping children, unknowingly treating some from the very orphanage where her sister grew up under a different name. She had walked the same streets as Michelle, perhaps even passed her by, neither aware of their connection. The final twist of fate's knife was that Sarah died never knowing that her sister was so close, living just across town. Her last day had been ordinary in its tragedy. Melissa, then too, had developed a high fever. The medicine cabinet was empty and James was stuck in an important meeting. "I'll just run to the pharmacy," Sarah had said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Mummy will be right back." The rain slicked roads and a drunk driver ensured that promise would remain forever broken. Among Sarah's personal effects, which James still couldn't bring himself to pack away, lay a small box containing childhood mementos. Inside was a photograph of two little girls, Sarah and Emily, and a handkerchief identical to the one Michelle treasured, except this one bore the initials EW, or Emily Winchester. The key to unlocking the mystery of Michelle's identity lay in that box, waiting to be discovered. Sarah's influence remained strongest in the garden she had lovingly tended. The roses she planted still bloomed each spring, their scent drifting through open windows. It was here that Melissa often came to feel close to her mother, sitting among the flowers and telling them about her day. And it would be here, in this garden, where the truth about Michelle's identity would finally come to light. The hospital wing dedicated to Sarah's memory stood as a testament to her legacy of compassion. The Sarah Wilson Children's Center specialized in treating underprivileged children, providing care regardless of their family's ability to pay. The center's walls were adorned with butterfly motifs, Sarah's favorite symbol of hope and transformation, the same butterfly that graced both handkerchiefs. In her final journal entry, written the morning of her death, Sarah had penned words that would prove prophetic. "Sometimes I wonder if Emily is out there, maybe even in Austin, looking for me too. I pray that if anything ever happens to me, someone will look after Melissa with the same love I wished I could have given my sister. Life has a way of bringing lost souls together when they need each other most." These words, yet to be discovered, would take on new meaning when Michelle entered their lives. The universe, it seemed, had a plan to honor Sarah's last wish in ways none of them could have imagined. Through Michelle, Sarah's legacy of love and healing would continue, though the path to this revelation would be paved with trials and tears. The autumn sun was setting over downtown Austin, casting long shadows between the skyscrapers as James Wilson hurried from his office building. His mind was preoccupied with the board meeting he'd just left, barely noticing the darkening streets around him. He'd parked in a side alley, a decision he would soon regret. Checking his watch, 6:45 p.m., James quickened his pace. He'd promised Melissa he'd be home for dinner tonight, a promise he was determined to keep after breaking too many others. The sound of his expensive leather shoes echoed off the brick walls as he approached his car, keys already in hand. The attack came swiftly and without warning. Two men materialized from the shadows, one blocking his path to the car, the other circling behind him. Their faces were obscured by dark hoodies, but their intentions were clear. The taller one brandished a knife that gleamed dully in the fading light. "Wallet and watch." Rich man, the one with the knife demanded, his voice rough with barely contained violence. "Phone too. Nice and easy, and nobody gets hurt." James raised his hands slowly, his CEO's mind racing through scenarios, calculating risks and opportunities. "Let's stay calm," he said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "I'll give you what you want." The second man grew impatient, shoving James against his car. "Stop talking and start handing stuff." Over. The force of the push sent James's briefcase clattering to the ground, papers spilling across the wet pavement. From somewhere nearby came the sound of a car being washed, the quiet splash of water and the squeak of a sponge against metal. Michelle Carter, finishing her last job of the day, heard the commotion. She peered around the corner, her heart stopping at the scene before her. Without hesitation, she grabbed her bucket of soapy water. Years of surviving in the orphanage had taught her to act fast in dangerous situations. "Hey!" she shouted, stepping into view. Police. Drop the knife." The authority in her voice made the attackers hesitate for a crucial moment. Michelle seized the opportunity, hurling the bucket of water at the knife wielder. The sudden splash caught him off guard, causing him to stumble backward, losing his grip on the weapon. James took advantage of the distraction, driving his elbow back into the second attacker's solar plexus. The man doubled over, gasping for air. Michelle grabbed a handful of gravel from the ground and threw it at their faces, the small stones stinging their eyes. "Run!" Michelle shouted at James, already moving to position herself between him and the attackers. But James, despite his expensive suit and corporate demeanor, stood his ground beside her. The sight of this small, brave woman facing down armed attackers awakened something protective in him. The robbers, realizing their easy target had become anything but, began to back away. "This ain't worth it," the one who dropped the knife muttered to his partner. They turned and fled, disappearing into the maze of alleyways as quickly as they had appeared. In the aftermath, James and Michelle stood breathing heavily, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. He turned to her, taking in her worn clothes and calloused hands, markers of a life worked hard for every penny. "That was incredibly brave," he said. "You could have been hurt." Michelle shrugged, suddenly self-conscious under his scrutiny. "I couldn't just watch," she said simply. "I've seen too many people get hurt because others looked away." James noticed her shivering in her wet clothes, the bucket of water having splashed back on her during the confrontation. Without hesitation, he removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "I'm James Wilson," he said. "Please, let me buy you a coffee. It's the least I can do." Michelle started to decline, but something in his eyes, kindness mixed with residual concern, made her pause. "Michelle Carter," she replied, accepting both the jacket and the invitation. "I know a small cafe around the corner." As they walked together toward the cafe, neither could have known that this chance encounter would set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. The universe had orchestrated this meeting with careful precision, bringing together two souls connected by bonds deeper than either could imagine. The cafe was a small, dimly lit establishment tucked between two larger buildings. Steam rose from their coffee cups as James and Michelle sat in a quiet corner booth, the events of the last hour still hanging in the air between them. James had ordered them both large coffees and, despite Michelle's protests, a plate of warm pastries. So Michelle James began, studying her with newfound interest. "Tell me about yourself. What brings you to washing cars in business alleys?" His tone was gentle, curious rather than judgmental. Michelle wrapped her hands around the warm cup, his suit jacket still draped over her shoulders. "I do what I can to make ends meet," she replied, her pride evident in her straight posture. "I'm taking night classes at the community college, studying psychology. During the day, I wash cars, sometimes help at a local daycare center." As she spoke about her work with children, her eyes lit up with a familiar passion that struck James deeply. It was the same look Sarah had when talking about her young patients. "You enjoy working with children?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "They're honest," Michelle smiled. "In the orphanage, I used to look after the younger ones. Sometimes all they need is someone to listen, to make them feel seen." She paused, realizing she'd revealed more than intended. James's expression softened further. "You grew up in an orphanage?" The question was gentle, giving her space to decline answering. Michelle nodded, taking a sip of coffee before responding. "St. Mary's. 18 years. I aged out 4 years ago." Her voice remained steady, but her fingers tightened around the cup. A plan began forming in James's mind. He thought of Melissa, lonely in their big house, and Margaret's increasing complaints about needing help with childcare. "Michelle, I have a proposition for you," he said carefully. "I'm a single father. My daughter, Melissa, is 7. We've been looking for someone to help care for her, someone who could be more than just a babysitter." Michelle's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Wilson, Please call me James, he interrupted. The position would include room and board, a good salary, and time for your studies. After what you did today, I know you're someone I can trust with my daughter's safety. The offer hung between them, heavy with possibility. Michelle sat silent for a moment, processing. Why me, she finally asked. You don't know anything about me? James leaned back, his expression thoughtful. I know you risked your safety to help a stranger. I know you work hard and study harder. I know you care about children. And I know my daughter needs someone like you in her life. Michelle's throat tightened with emotion. What about references, background checks? We can handle all that, James assured her, but sometimes you have to trust your instincts. Mine are telling me this is right. As they discussed the details, neither could shake the feeling that this moment was meant to be. James outlined the responsibilities, the schedule, the benefits. Michelle listened intently, her heart racing with the possibility of a new life. There's one more thing, James added. Our housekeeper, Margaret Reynolds, has been with us for years. She can be protective of Melissa. It might take time for her to warm up to you. Michelle smiled wryly. I'm used to earning people's trust, Mr. Wilson James. It's been the story of my life. As they finished their coffee, James handed her his business card. Take the night to think about it. Call me tomorrow with your decision. Standing outside the cafe, Michelle handed back his jacket. The night air had cooled, but she felt warmer than she had in years. Hope, that dangerous emotion she'd learned to guard against, bloomed in her chest. Thank you for the coffee, she said, and for the opportunity. I'll call you tomorrow. James watched her walk away, struck by an inexplicable feeling that he'd just set something monumental in motion. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Melissa's asking for you. When will you be home? Looking at the message, James smiled. He had a feeling things were about to change for all of them, in ways none of them could predict. Margaret Reynolds stood at the kitchen window of the Wilson mansion, her hands methodically drying a dinner plate as she watched James's car pull into the driveway. After 20 years of service to the family, she prided herself on anticipating their needs, maintaining order in their lives. The news James was about to share would shake that carefully maintained order to its core. Margaret, James called as he entered, his voice carrying an unusual note of excitement. Is Melissa still awake? I have something to discuss with both of you. She found him in his study, removing his tie with one hand while holding his phone in the other. She's in her room, reading, Margaret replied, noting his disheveled appearance and missing jacket with concern. James, what's happened? You look unsettled. James's face broke into a smile that made Margaret's stomach tighten with apprehension. I found someone to help with Melissa, he announced. A young woman named Michelle Carter. She saved me from a robbery attempt today. She's perfect for what we need. Margaret's hands clutched her apron, knuckles whitening. A stranger? Who stopped a robbery? Her voice rose slightly. James, surely you're not serious about bringing someone you've just met into our home. Our home, she thought, realizing she'd said it out loud. But wasn't it? After raising Melissa since infancy, after standing by James through Sarah's death, hadn't she earned the right to consider it her home too? She's studying psychology, works with children, James continued, either missing or choosing to ignore Margaret's distress. There's something special about her, Margaret, something that reminds me of Sarah. The comparison to Sarah felt like a physical blow. Margaret sank into a chair, memories flooding back Sarah's kindness when Margaret's husband died, her insistence that Margaret wasn't just staff but family. Have you run any background checks? Called references? She could be anyone, James. We will, of course, James assured her, sitting behind his desk, but my instincts tell me she's exactly what Melissa needs right now, what we all need. Margaret's throat tightened. What we all need is to be careful. After Sarah, she paused, gathering herself. We can't just replace what we've lost with the first person who shows an act of kindness. James's expression softened. No one's replacing anyone, Margaret. Michelle will be here to help, not to take over. You're still an essential part of this family. But Margaret barely heard him over the roaring in her ears. Images of her own loss surfaced. Her daughter Emily, lost to drugs and bad choices, last seen heading west with promises to get clean and make things right. Every stranger since then had been a potential threat, someone who might bring more pain into their lives. I need to meet her first, Margaret declared, standing abruptly, before Melissa gets attached, before any decisions are made. James nodded, relief evident in his expression. Of course, she'll come by tomorrow morning. Just keep an open mind, Margaret, please. Later that night, after Melissa had been tucked in with promises of exciting news tomorrow, Margaret stood in Sarah's garden. The roses Sarah had planted still bloomed, their fragrance a ghostly reminder of all they'd lost. "What would you do, Sarah?" she whispered to the flowers. "Would you trust a stranger with your daughter's heart?" As if in answer, a cool breeze stirred the roses, carrying their scent around her. Margaret remembered Sarah's words from years ago. Sometimes the family we need finds us in unexpected ways. But Sarah wasn't here, and Margaret had appointed herself guardian not just of the house, but of Sarah's memory, of Melissa's safety, of the delicate balance they'd achieved in their grief. Tomorrow she would meet this Michelle Carter. She would watch, evaluate, protect. Because that's what family did, they protected their own. And despite James's assurances, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. In her room, she took out the last photo she had of her own daughter, traced the familiar features with a trembling finger. "I won't let anyone else get hurt," she promised the smiling face in the photograph. Not this time. Michelle arrived at the Wilson mansion precisely at 9 the next morning, her few possessions packed in a worn backpack. She wore her best outfit, a simple blue dress bought from a thrift store and carefully pressed the night before. Standing before the imposing front door, she took a deep breath, touching the embroidered handkerchief in her pocket for luck. Melissa Wilson sat cross-legged at the top of the grand staircase, peering through the railings as Michelle entered. The 7-year-old had been vibrating with excitement since breakfast, when her father announced they were getting a new special friend to help take care of her. "Hello," Michelle called softly, spotting Melissa's partially hidden face. "You must be Melissa." "I'm Michelle," she smiled, noticing how the little girl's eyes widened with interest. Melissa stood up slowly, still holding onto the railing. "Did you really save my daddy from bad guys?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity and a touch of awe. Michelle laughed gently. "Well, we helped each other. Sometimes that's what friends do." She climbed a few steps, stopping at a respectful distance. "I like your butterfly hair clips. Purple is my favorite color too." Something in Michelle's voice, warm and genuine, made Melissa venture closer. "Do you want to see my room? I have a whole collection of butterflies. Mummy loved them too." The words tumbled out eagerly, and then she froze, glancing nervously at Margaret, who stood watching from the doorway. But Michelle didn't miss a beat. "I'd love to see them. And maybe you can tell me about your mom?" She sounds like she was very special. The gentle acknowledgement of Sarah, neither avoiding nor dwelling on the loss, made both Melissa and Margaret take notice. Melissa practically bounced down the remaining stairs, grabbing Michelle's hand. "Come on, I'll show you everything." The natural ease between them was immediately apparent. In Melissa's room, Michelle listened attentively as the little girl showed her treasures, drawings, toys, and most importantly, the butterfly collection. "This one was Mum's," Melissa explained, pointing to a framed specimen. "Daddy says she caught it in the garden when she was pregnant with me." As Melissa chatted, Michelle noticed subtle signs of loneliness in the room's single chairs at the tea party table, books worn from repeated reading, dolls arranged like audience members. She recognized these signs from her own childhood, the careful creation of company where none existed. "Would you like to have a tea party?" Melissa asked hopefully. "Margaret usually says she's too busy and Daddy doesn't really know how to play right." Michelle smiled warmly. "I would love to. But first, may I suggest something? She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small packet of construction paper. When I was your age, I used to make paper butterflies to keep me company. Would you like to learn how? For the next hour, they sat on the floor together, folding and cutting paper into delicate shapes. Michelle taught Melissa how to add patterns and designs, sharing stories about the butterflies she used to imagine in the orphanage garden. You didn't have a mummy either, Melissa asked suddenly, her hands stilling on the paper. No, Michelle answered honestly. But you know what? That means we understand each other in a special way. And now we can be each other's special friends. Melissa looked up at her, eyes bright with unshed tears and hope. Promise you won't leave? Like Mummy did. Michelle's heart clenched. She gently took Melissa's small hands in hers. I promise to always be honest with you, Melissa. I can't promise nothing will ever change, but I can promise that right now, I'm here for you, and I'll do everything I can to stay as long as you need me. The honesty of the answer, so different from the usual adult reassurances, seemed to satisfy Melissa. She leaned forward and hugged Michelle tightly. I'm glad you saved Daddy, she whispered. From the doorway, unnoticed by either of them, Margaret watched the interaction with conflicting emotions. The scene before her was both heartwarming and terrifying, Melissa opening up more in 1 hour than she had in months, while a stranger gained her trust so easily. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks watching Michelle like a hawk, documenting every interaction, every potential misstep. She kept a small notebook hidden in her apron pocket, jotting down observations that grew increasingly frustrating in their positivity. Michelle was unfailingly patient with Melissa, meticulous in her duties, and respectfully distant with James. One evening, after Melissa had gone to bed, Margaret sat at her desk reviewing her notes. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she flipped through pages of entries, helped Melissa with homework without being asked, made sure she ate her vegetables by turning them into butterfly shapes, stayed up late sewing Melissa's torn teddy bear. Frustrated, Margaret opened her laptop. The background check James had run came back clean, but Margaret knew there had to be more. She typed Michelle Carter St. Mary's Orphanage into the search engine, her fingers striking the keys with determined force. The search yielded a small article from 12 years ago, a story about a stolen locket at the orphanage. Margaret's heart raced as she read about a young girl accused of theft, but her triumph turned to unease as she continued reading. The locket had been found months later behind a radiator, likely fallen there by accident. The accused girl's name was never mentioned to protect her privacy, but the dates matched Michelle's time there. Still searching for dirt on the girl, a voice startled her. James stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of disappointment and concern. Margaret quickly closed the laptop, but not before James glimpsed the search terms. I'm protecting this family, she said defensively. We know nothing about her. We know she spends extra time helping Melissa with her nightmares. We know she keeps a photo of Sarah on Melissa's nightstand so they can say goodnight to her. We know she's managed to make my daughter laugh again. James's voice was gentle but firm. Margaret stood, her hands trembling slightly. That's exactly what worries me. She's too perfect, too good to be true. No one is that perfect unless they're hiding something. Like Emily was hiding something, James asked softly, naming Margaret's long-lost daughter for the first time in years. Margaret flinched as if struck. That's not fair, James. No, what's not fair is punishing Michelle for your fears about the past. He stepped into the room, placing a hand on Margaret's shoulder. I miss Sarah too, and I understand your fear of losing anyone else. But Melissa needs this. Maybe we all do. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. I hear her, you know. Late at night when she thinks everyone's asleep, she sings to Melissa the same lullaby Sarah used to sing. How does she even know that song? Perhaps some things are meant to be, James suggested. Sarah always said the universe has its own way of healing broken hearts. Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. I found out about the locket incident, she admitted. She was wrongly accused. just like she trailed off, thinking of Emily's false accusations against friends who had tried to help her. "Maybe that's why she understands Melissa so well," James said. "She knows what it's like to be hurt by circumstances beyond her control." Through the open window, they heard soft laughter from the garden. Michelle and Melissa were still up, counting stars and making wishes. Melissa's voice carried clearly, "I wish Michelle could stay forever." Margaret watched them through the window, her heart conflicting with her fears. Michelle was pointing out constellations, her free hand absently touching something in her pocket, a flash of embroidered cloth that caught Margaret's attention. "What is that she always carries?" Margaret wondered aloud. "Why don't you ask her?" James suggested. "Try talking to her, Margaret, not as someone to investigate, but as someone who might understand loss and longing better than most." As James left, Margaret remained at the window, watching Michelle teach Melissa how to find the North Star. The scene reminded her painfully of Sarah doing the same with Melissa years ago. But for the first time, the memory didn't feel like a betrayal. She closed her notebook, tucking it into her desk drawer instead of her apron pocket. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask Michelle about the handkerchief. Not to investigate, but to understand. Perhaps James was right, perhaps they all had more in common than she wanted to admit. The exclusive neighborhood where the Wilson mansion stood buzzed with gossip about the new addition to the household. At the weekly garden club meeting, hosted by Eleanor Patterson, the unofficial queen of local society, Michelle's presence became the main topic of discussion. "I heard she was some sort of street urchin," James picked up, Eleanor declared, stirring her tea with calculated precision. "Margaret told my housekeeper she simply appeared one day, claiming to have saved James from muggers. How convenient." The other ladies murmured their agreement, their perfectly manicured hands clutching delicate teacups as they exchanged knowing looks. "And to think he's letting her live in the house," Barbara Mitchell added, her voice dripping with concern. Right down the hall from little Melissa. The rumors spread like wildfire through the neighborhood's social circles. Parents at Melissa's private school began questioning the wisdom of allowing their children to visit for playdates. Invitations to social events that had always included the entire Wilson household now specifically excluded Michelle. One afternoon, Michelle overheard two mothers whispering at school pickup. "They say she's just waiting for the right moment to rob them blind," one said. "I mean, look at her background, an orphan, working on the streets. It's like inviting trouble right into your home." Michelle held her head high as she walked past them, Melissa's small hand clutched tightly in hers. The little girl, sensing the tension, looked up at Michelle. "Why are Tommy's parents whispering about you?" "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different from what they're used to," Michelle explained gently. "But that's okay. What matters is that we know the truth about each other." The situation came to a head at Melissa's school ballet recital. Michelle sat with the family in the front row, helping Melissa with last-minute costume adjustments. Eleanor Patterson approached, her smile sharp as cut glass. "James," she began, pointedly ignoring Michelle, "the board members and I have been talking. We feel it might be inappropriate to have household staff attending these private events. It sets an uncomfortable precedent." Before James could respond, Melissa, overhearing while in her tutu, burst into tears. "But Michelle has to stay. She helped me practice every day. She made my costume perfect. She's not staff, she's my friend." The outburst drew attention from nearby parents. Michelle started to stand, ready to excuse herself to avoid causing more drama, but James's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Michelle stays," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the now silent auditorium. "She's family, Eleanor, and if that makes anyone uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine why they feel threatened by kindness and dedication." Margaret, watching from a few rows back, surprised everyone by speaking up. "I've worked for the Wilsons for 20 years, she announced, and I've never seen Melissa happier or more confident than she's been since Michelle arrived. Anyone who can't see that is choosing not to." Eleanor retreated, clearly shocked by the public rebuke. As the recital began, other parents started to notice what James and Margaret had seen. They watched Michelle mouthing the steps along with Melissa's performance, saw her quick thumbs up when Melissa looked nervous, noticed how the child seemed to dance with more confidence knowing Michelle was there. After the performance, while Melissa basked in praise and flowers, Catherine Chen, another mother, approached Michelle. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "My Tommy told me how you helped him when he fell in the playground last week. How you didn't just bandage his knee but taught him a Brave Knight's song to stop his tears. I judged you without knowing you, and I was wrong." Gradually, the tide of opinion began to turn. The mothers who had whispered now saw Michelle helping not just Melissa but any child who needed it. The neighbors who had gossiped witnessed her quiet dedication to the family, her respectful interaction with Margaret, her careful maintenance of appropriate boundaries with James. One by one, the community began to accept that perhaps love and family couldn't be defined by social status or background. Even Eleanor Patterson, though she never admitted being wrong, began including Michelle's name on invitations. Through it all, Michelle remained unchanged, patient with prejudice, kind to critics, and focused solely on Melissa's well-being. Her grace under pressure only served to underline what James had seen that first night, someone whose true worth far exceeded society's superficial judgments. Summer arrived in Austin with a stifling heat that drove everyone indoors except for Michelle and Melissa, who spent their afternoons in Sarah's butterfly garden. One particularly humid day, as they tended to the roses Sarah had planted years ago, Michelle wiped sweat from her brow, inadvertently leaving a smudge of dirt across her face. "You look just like the picture," Melissa exclaimed suddenly, her eyes wide with recognition. "What picture, sweetheart?" Michelle asked, reaching for her water bottle. "Come on, I'll show you." Melissa grabbed Michelle's hand, pulling her into the house with urgent excitement. They climbed the stairs to James's study, where Melissa approached a wall of family photographs. She pointed to one in particular, a young Sarah Wilson, gardening in a sundress, a smudge of dirt across her cheek, her green eyes bright with laughter. Michelle froze, staring at the photograph. The resemblance was uncanny, the same green eyes, the same curve of the jaw, even the way their hair fell across their foreheads. Her hand unconsciously went to the embroidered handkerchief in her pocket, the one with the initials SW. Margaret, entering with a tray of lemonade, dropped it with a crash. Glass shattered across the hardwood floor, but she barely noticed, her eyes darting between the photograph and Michelle's face. "Dear God," she whispered. James arrived home early that day to find an unusual silence hanging over the house. He found them all in his study, Michelle sitting pale-faced on the sofa, Melissa curled against her side, Margaret pacing by the window, and the broken glass still scattered across the floor. "What's happened?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "Show him," Margaret said to Melissa. "Show your father what you noticed." Melissa led James to the photograph, repeating her observation about the resemblance. James studied the image, then turned to look at Michelle. How had he not seen it before? The same eyes that had drawn him to Sarah years ago were looking back at him now, filled with confusion and fear. "Michelle," he said carefully, "do you know anything about your birth family?" She pulled out the handkerchief with trembling hands. "Just this. It was with me when I was left at St. Mary's. The initials." SW. James finished, his voice barely a whisper. "Sarah Winchester." Margaret sank into a chair. Sarah always talked about her lost sister, Emily. There was a fire. Their parents. The girls were separated in the system. Emily, Michelle's voice cracked. "My name." At the orphanage, they found a note with my name. Michelle Emily Carter. James moved to his desk, pulling out a small wooden box. Inside lay another handkerchief, identical to Michelle's but with different initials, EW. "Sarah kept this," he explained. "It was her sister's. She never stopped looking." Melissa, watching the adults with growing understanding, suddenly burst into tears. Does this mean Michelle is my aunt? My real aunt. My real aunt. The word hung in the air, aunt. Michelle felt the room spinning. All these years of loneliness, of wondering about her family, and she had been just across town from her sister, a sister she would never meet, who had died still searching for her. There's a way to know for sure, James said gently. We can do a DNA test. Michelle nodded numbly, still clutching the handkerchief. Sarah. She worked at the children's hospital, didn't she? I remember a doctor there when I was 12. She was so kind to me. She told me stories about butterflies to distract me from getting shots. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. That was Sarah's signature move with scared children. She believed butterflies were messages from guardian angels. The weight of lost opportunities pressed down on them, all the sisters who had been so close yet never knew. The Aunt Melissa should have grown up knowing the family connection that had been there all along. We'll need to confirm it, James said, his voice thick with emotion. But Michelle, if this is true, you're not just Melissa's caretaker. You're family. You've always been family. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through Sarah's butterfly garden, they sat together in the study, processing this revelation. Melissa refused to leave Michelle's side, as if afraid her newly discovered aunt might disappear. And Michelle, overwhelmed by belonging after so many years of being alone, finally understood why she had felt drawn to this house, to this family, from the very beginning. The revelation about Michelle's connection to Sarah stirred something deep in Margaret's memory. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, she sat alone in her room, pulling out an old leather album she hadn't opened in years. Inside, faded photographs told the story of her own loss. The first photo showed a teenage girl with Margaret's eyes and determined chin, holding a tennis trophy. Emily Reynolds had been a star athlete, destined for a scholarship, before the pills took everything. Margaret traced her daughter's face with a trembling finger, remembering the slow descent that tore their family apart. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. Michelle stood in the doorway, 2 cups of tea in her hands. I thought you might still be awake, she said softly. May I come in? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Michelle placed 1 cup beside her, noticing the open album but respectfully averting her eyes. I wanted to thank you, Michelle began, for all you've done for Melissa, for keeping Sarah's memory alive. Something in Michelle's gentle tone broke through Margaret's carefully constructed walls. I had a daughter once, she found herself saying. Her name was Emily too. Michelle sat quietly, letting Margaret continue at her own pace. The older woman turned the album pages, showing Michelle photographs that documented a family's gradual unraveling. She was so bright, so full of life. Then she started running with the wrong crowd in high school. When things went missing around the house, I blamed her friends. I couldn't see. Didn't want to see. Her voice cracked as she reached the last photo. Emily, thin and pale, promising to get clean, to come home soon. That was 8 years ago. The last time I saw her. Every time the phone rings late at night, I think. She couldn't finish the sentence. Is that why you were so suspicious of me? Michelle asked gently, understanding dawning in her eyes. Margaret nodded, wiping away tears. When James brought you home, all I could see was another young woman who might hurt this family. I couldn't bear to watch them get hurt again. But I was wrong about Emily's friends back then, and I was wrong about you. She pulled out another photograph, one that made Michelle gasp. It showed Emily Reynolds at 16, standing before a butterfly garden remarkably similar to Sarah's. But what caught Michelle's attention was the distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark on Emily's wrist, identical to her own. Margaret, Michelle whispered, extending her arm to show her own birthmark. How? Margaret's hands shook as she held Michelle's wrist, examining the mark she'd seen so many times on her own daughter. It's not possible, she breathed. The adoption agency said Emily was found. At St. Mary's Orphanage, Michelle finished. Left there as a baby with a note giving her name as Michelle Emily Carter. The implications crashed over them both. Margaret's Emily hadn't been lost to drugs, she'd been stolen as an infant, given a new identity, while another girl, the real Michelle Carter, had lived Margaret's daughter's troubled life. "All these years," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "You were right here, my Emily. And I've been so cruel to you." Michelle sat frozen, trying to process this second earth-shattering revelation in one day. Not only was she Sarah Winchester's sister, but she was also Margaret Reynolds' long-lost daughter. The universe had brought her not to one family, but two. Does this mean Michelle started, then stopped, overwhelmed? "It means you were never alone," Margaret said fiercely, pulling Michelle into an embrace both had longed for without knowing it. "It means you belong here twice over, my daughter." Sarah's sister, Melissa's aunt. They sat together until dawn, going through photographs, sharing stories, filling in the blank spaces in each other's lives. Every small similarity took on new meaning: their shared love of gardening, their protective instincts toward children, even their tendency to hum while working. As the sun rose, casting early light through the window, Margaret touched the birthmark on Michelle's wrist one more time. "I think Sarah knew," she said quietly. "Somehow she knew when she encouraged James to build that butterfly garden. She was leading you home." Michelle leaned against her newfound mother's shoulder, finally understanding why the Wilson house had felt like home from the first moment. She wasn't just finding her place, she was reclaiming it, piece by piece healing 3 generations of broken hearts in the process. The days following the dual revelations brought a fragile peace to the Wilson household, but that tranquility was about to be shattered. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the front door before dawn. Margaret found it while doing her morning rounds, a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a typed message that made her blood run cold. "Do you really think you can play happy families? Ask Michelle about the missing locket. Some secrets don't stay buried." At the bottom was a grainy photograph of a young Michelle at St. Mary's Orphanage, standing near the headmistress's office. Margaret's first instinct was to destroy it, to protect Michelle from more pain, but before she could decide, James entered the foyer, immediately noticing her distress. "What is it?" he asked, taking the letter from her trembling hands. "Someone knows," Margaret whispered. "About Michelle, about everything." More letters followed over the next week, each more threatening than the last. "The perfect nanny with a criminal past. Does James know what really happened that night? How much is your silence worth?" The police were called, but with no fingerprints and no leads, they could do little but advise increased security. James hired guards, installed cameras, but the letters kept coming, now accompanied by photos: Michelle washing cars, Michelle at her night classes, Michelle in the garden with Melissa. "Someone's been watching me," Michelle realized, her face pale as she looked through the latest batch. "For months, maybe longer." The strain began to show. Melissa picked up on the tension, becoming clingy and anxious. Michelle started checking locks compulsively, jumping at shadows. Margaret alternated between fierce protectiveness and gnawing fear that her newly recovered daughter might be taken from her again. Then came the letter that changed everything. Ask Robert Hayes about the real Michelle Carter. Ask him what happened the night of the fire. James recognized the name immediately: Robert Hayes, his former business partner, whom he'd forced out of the company 5 years ago after discovering financial irregularities. Hayes had sworn revenge, but disappeared before any charges could be filed. He was on the board of St. Mary's Orphanage, James remembered, digging through old files. He would have had access to records, to information about the children. Michelle sat heavily in a chair, pieces falling into place. The locket incident, it was a setup. I remember Mr. Hayes being there that day, watching when they accused me. He's the one who suggested checking my room. Margaret's detective work finally paid off as she uncovered the terrible truth. Hayes had orchestrated the baby swap all those years ago, using his position at both the orphanage and adoption agencies to move children around. The real Michelle Carter had indeed died of an overdose the girl Margaret had been tracking all these years. But he's been watching, waiting, James realized. When I hired you, he must have recognized you. Now he's trying to destroy everything, just like he promised. The final threat arrived attached to a small butterfly pendant, one identical to the pendant in Sarah's hospital ID photo. Tomorrow everything ends. Say goodbye to your fake family. That night, as security patrolled the grounds, the household gathered in the living room, refusing to be separated. Melissa fell asleep between Michelle and Margaret, one hand clutching each of them. James sat across from them, making calls, pulling strings, trying to locate Hayes. "I won't let him take this away from us," Michelle said firmly, looking at her newfound family. "We've lost too much time already." Margaret squared her shoulders, her protective instincts in full force. "He doesn't understand what he's up against. A mother's love isn't something you can threaten away." As dawn approached, they made plans. They would not run, would not hide, would not let fear tear apart what fate had so carefully brought together. But none of them could have predicted what Hayes had planned or how far he would go to exact his revenge. The next day would bring fire and fear, courage and revelation, and a final confrontation that would test the bonds of their newly united family. But for now they drew strength from each other, 4 hearts beating as one, waiting for whatever morning would bring. The day of Hayes' threatened revenge dawned hot and windless. Despite the added security, an atmosphere of dread hung over the Wilson mansion. James had insisted on staying home from work. Michelle wouldn't let Melissa out of her sight, and Margaret patrolled the house with nervous energy. None of them noticed the figure that had slipped into the basement during the guard rotation, or the gasoline being methodically splashed in strategic locations. Robert Hayes, once an esteemed businessman, now moved with the calculated precision of someone with nothing left to lose. His once expensive suit hung loose on his gaunt frame, his eyes holding the fevered gleam of long-nursed vengeance. The first sign of trouble came mid-afternoon. Michelle was helping Melissa with her homework in the upstairs study when she noticed an acrid smell seeping through the floorboards. Before she could investigate, smoke began curling under the door. "Melissa, sweetheart," Michelle said calmly, though her heart was racing. "Remember the fire drill we practiced? We need to do it now. For real." But when Michelle opened the door, she saw that Hayes had planned well. The main staircase was already engulfed in flames, cutting off their primary escape route. Thick black smoke was rapidly filling the upper hallway. The back stairs, Michelle decided, lifting Melissa into her arms. But as they reached the servants' stairwell, they heard an ominous crack. Part of the ceiling collapsed, blocking their escape route with burning debris. Downstairs, Margaret was the first to spot the flames. She immediately triggered the alarm and called emergency services, then tried to reach the stairs, only to be driven back by intense heat. "Michelle, Melissa," she screamed, her worst fears materializing. James arrived moments later, having been in the garden. He attempted to charge up the burning staircase, but was restrained by security guards. "My daughter's up there," he fought against their grip. "Let me go." In the study, Michelle had wrapped Melissa in a wet blanket from the bathroom. "We're going to play a game," she told the frightened child. "Close your eyes tight and keep them closed. Hold on to me and don't let go, no matter what." Michelle could see only one option. Sarah's garden terrace was just outside the study window, with a sloped roof below it, if they could reach it. She broke the window with a chair, using her jacket to clear the sharp edges. "When I say butterfly," she instructed Melissa, "take a deep breath and hold it. Like we practiced in swimming class, remember?" The smoke was getting thicker, the heat more intense. Michelle could hear the fire crackling closer, feel the floor becoming dangerously hot beneath them. She gathered Melissa close, whispering a quick prayer to Sarah. That's when Hayes appeared in the doorway, his figure distorted by smoke and flames. "No one leaves," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "This ends here. Everything burns." "Why?" Michelle demanded, shielding Melissa. "Why destroy so many lives?" "Because James destroyed mine," Hayes shouted. "He took everything, my company, my reputation, my future. Now he loses everything too." Michelle stood straighter, Sarah's strength flowing through her. "You're wrong. Love can't be destroyed by fire. Sarah taught me that, even though I never met her. And I won't let you hurt her daughter." "Butterfly!" Michelle shouted, and Melissa took a deep breath. In one fluid motion, Michelle charged forward, shouldering past a surprised Hayes. She ran through the smoke-filled hallway, feeling the floor creak dangerously beneath them. The heat was unbearable, her lungs screaming for air. Michelle's clothes began to smolder, her hair singed by the flames, but she didn't stop. Sarah's garden terrace was just ahead, their last chance. Outside, James and Margaret watched in horror as flames engulfed the upper floor. Fire trucks were arriving, but everyone knew they might be too late. Then, through the smoke, they saw a figure appear on the terrace, Michelle, with Melissa clutched tightly in her arms. "There's a ladder coming," James shouted. "Hold on." But the terrace was beginning to collapse. Michelle looked down at the rose bushes below Sarah's roses. In that moment, she swore she felt her sister's presence, guiding her, protecting them. The world seemed to slow down as Michelle made her decision. The roses below might break their fall enough to survive, but she had to protect Melissa. With skilled movements born from years of caring for younger children, Michelle wrapped Melissa more securely in the wet blanket. "Keep your eyes closed, sweetheart," she whispered. "Think of butterflies then." Holding Melissa tight against her chest, Michelle turned so her own body would take the impact. The terrace groaned beneath them, beginning to give way. Below, James watched in horror as Michelle leaped just as the terrace collapsed. She twisted in midair, ensuring she would hit the roses first. The impact was brutal. Thorns tore through her clothes. Branches snapped under their weight, but Sarah's beloved roses cushioned their fall just enough. "Melissa." Michelle. James ran forward with Margaret close behind. Michelle lay still, her body curled protectively around Melissa. As they reached them, Melissa stirred, opening her eyes. "Daddy," she coughed. "Michelle saved me. Like an angel." But Michelle didn't move. Blood seeped through her burned clothes where the thorns had pierced her skin. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Paramedics rushed forward, carefully separating the two and beginning emergency treatment. Above them, Hayes appeared at a window, trapped by his own fire. His face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized his plan had failed. She wasn't supposed to survive, he screamed. None of them were supposed to survive. As firefighters aimed their hoses at the blaze, Hayes began throwing papers from the window, documents that fluttered down like deadly snowflakes. Margaret caught one, her hands shaking as she read. "James," she gasped. "These are adoption records, hospital documents. Hayes, he was behind everything. The baby swap, the false accusations, all of it." Through the smoke and chaos, Hayes' voice carried down to them. "You want the truth, James? I planned it all." Sarah was getting too close to the truth about the orphanage's finances. She was investigating missing children, so I made sure she'd never find her sister. I separated them, created false records, watched them live their lives apart. Then when she died, I thought it was over. But you had to hire Michelle, had to bring her into your perfect life. The confession echoed across the burning garden as firefighters finally reached Hayes, restraining him even as he continued to rant. "I took everything from you, just like you took everything from me." Meanwhile, paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Michelle. Her vital signs were weakening, her burns severe. As they lifted her onto a stretcher, something fell from her pocket, the embroidered handkerchief, now stained with blood and ash. Melissa broke free from her father's grip, running to grab it. "She needs this," she cried. "It's from her real family. It gives her strength." Margaret cradled her daughter's hand as the paramedics rushed her to the ambulance. "Hold on, sweetheart," she pleaded. "We just found you. We can't lose you again." James held Melissa close, watching the ambulance speed away. The mansion continued to burn behind them, but the material loss meant nothing compared to the possibility of losing Michelle. Fire trucks surrounded the property, their red lights painting the smoke-filled sky in surreal colors. As police led Hayes away in handcuffs, he continued to shout his confession, revealing years of corruption, fraud, and manipulation. His elaborate scheme to destroy James had instead exposed his own crimes, including his role in the tragic separation of Sarah and Michelle. Standing in Sarah's destroyed garden, James pulled out his phone to call his lawyer. The truth needed to be documented, justice needed to be served. But first, they had to get to the hospital. Michelle's life hung in the balance, and with it, the future of their newly united family. "Daddy," Melissa said softly as they hurried to the car, "the butterflies protected us. Just like Mummy always said they would." James looked at his daughter, then at the burning house where Sarah's butterfly decorations were being consumed by flames. Perhaps his late wife had been watching over them after all, guiding Michelle to save their daughter, just as she had saved Michelle's true identity from being lost forever. The hospital waiting room became their world for the next 72 hours. James, Margaret, and Melissa took turns sitting vigil while Michelle underwent multiple surgeries for her burns and injuries. The halls echoed with Melissa's prayers, whispered in the simple faith of a child who believed love could conquer anything. "She has to be okay," Melissa insisted, clutching the blood-stained handkerchief. She promised she wouldn't leave like Mummy did. The words pierced James's heart, reminding him of another hospital vigil 5 years ago, another loved one fighting for life. Margaret rarely left Michelle's bedside, her newfound daughter's hand clasped tightly in hers. She spoke constantly, sharing stories of Emily's childhood, the years she'd missed, the dreams she'd held. The doctors said patients in comas could often hear, and Margaret was determined to give Michelle every reason to fight her way back. News of Hayes' arrest and confessions spread quickly through Austin's social circles. The same people who had once whispered suspicions about Michelle now brought flowers and cards, filling the hospital room with colorful reminders of support. Eleanor Patterson herself arrived with tears in her eyes and a heartfelt apology for her previous judgment. On the third night, while Melissa slept curled in a waiting room chair, Detective Sarah Martinez arrived with updates on the investigation. "We found everything she told James and Margaret, records dating back 20 years. Hayes was running an illegal adoption network through St. Mary's. He separated dozens of families, all to hide his financial crimes." The detective spread photographs across the small table. Young Michelle at the orphanage, Sarah visiting the same orphanage as a doctor, Hayes lurking in the background of both images. He was obsessed with keeping them apart, Martinez explained. When Sarah started investigating missing children cases, Hayes knew she might discover the truth about Michelle. He'd been watching them both for years. Margaret's hands trembled as she looked at the evidence. All this time, she was so close. Both my girls were so close. She thought of the real Michelle Carter, the troubled young woman she'd been tracking. Now understanding she had been following the wrong person, her actual daughter within reach the whole time. James studied a particular photograph that showed Sarah at the hospital, treating a young Michelle for a minor injury. They did meet, he realized. Sarah treated her own sister without knowing it. The irony was almost too much to bear. Around midnight on the fourth day, while a summer storm raged outside, Michelle's vital signs began to strengthen. Her fingers twitched in Margaret's grasp, and her eyes flickered beneath their lids. The doctor said it was a positive sign, but warned them recovery would be a long journey. Melissa, who had refused to go home, climbed carefully onto the edge of Michelle's bed. "The butterflies in Mummy's garden saved us," she told her unconscious aunt. "They're magical, just like you said. Please wake up so we can plant new ones together." As if responding to the child's plea, Michelle's eyes slowly opened. She couldn't speak through the breathing tube, but her gaze found each of them: Margaret, her mother James, her brother-in-law and Melissa, her beloved niece. Tears rolled down her cheeks as Margaret gently squeezed her hand. "Welcome back, sweetheart," Margaret whispered. "You're home now, really home." Outside the hospital window, a monarch butterfly landed on the sill, its wings gleaming orange and black against the storm-dark sky. Melissa gasped in delight, pointing to it. "Look, Mummy sent us a sign." The butterfly stayed through the night, sheltering from the storm, its presence a reminder of Sarah's enduring love and the mysterious ways families find their way back to each other. As dawn broke, bringing with it the promise of Michelle's recovery, they all felt Sarah's spirit among them, completing their circle of healing. The weeks following the fire brought waves of devastating revelations. As Michelle slowly recovered in the hospital, police investigators uncovered the full extent of Hayes' crimes. The evidence painted a picture of manipulation and cruelty that spanned decades. In his office at the station, Detective Martinez spread out photographs across his desk for James and Margaret to view. Hayes didn't just separate Michelle from her family, he explained grimly. He orchestrated Sarah's accident. James felt the floor drop beneath him. "What are you saying?" Martinez pulled out a police report dated the night of Sarah's death. The drunk driver who hit Sarah's car was on Hayes' payroll. He was supposed to run her off the road, scare her into stopping her investigation. But things went wrong. Margaret sank into a chair, her face ashen. She was getting too close to the truth about Michelle, wasn't she? "Yes," Martinez confirmed. "We found Sarah's research files in Hayes' possession. She had traced several missing children to St. Mary's, including a baby girl with a crescent birthmark. She was days away from making the connection." Back at the hospital, Michelle struggled with her own demons. The burns across her back throbbed constantly, a physical reminder of the fire that had nearly claimed them all. But the emotional pain cut deeper, learning that her sister had died trying to find her, that they had been so close to reuniting, threatened to break her spirit. "I dreamed about her last night," Michelle confided to Margaret during one of their quiet evening talks. "She was in her garden, tending to the butterflies. She looked right at me, knew who I was, but I couldn't reach her. Every time I got close, she faded away." Melissa, too, carried her own burden of grief. The little girl who had already lost one mother figure now watched another suffer. Her nightmares returned with fierce intensity, dreams of fire, of losing Michelle the way she'd lost Sarah. One particularly difficult night, as rain lashed against the hospital windows, Melissa crept into Michelle's room, tears streaming down her face. "I saw Mummy in my dream," she whispered. "She was trying to warn us about the bad man, but we couldn't hear her." The police interviews continued, each revelation more heartbreaking than the last. Hayes had maintained detailed records of his orchestrated separations, dozens of families torn apart to hide his financial crimes. The documents revealed how he had manipulated records, bribed officials, and created false identities. Most devastating was the discovery that Hayes had been present at every crucial moment of their lives, watching Sarah's funeral from a distance, observing Michelle at the orphanage, even attending Melissa's school events under the guise of a board member. He was obsessed with watching his handiwork, Martinez explained. Like some sick puppet master, he wanted to see the pain he'd caused. James spent hours in Sarah's partially burned garden, salvaging what he could of her beloved roses. Each charred plant felt like another wound to his heart. "You were so close, my love," he whispered to Sarah's memory. "So close to bringing your sister home." The media descended like vultures, hungry for details of the scandal. Headlines screamed about corruption at St. Mary's, about Hayes' decades of crimes, about the tragic separation of the Winchester sisters. Reporters camped outside the hospital, forcing James to hire additional security to protect Michelle and Melissa from their intrusive questions. Margaret discovered her own heartbreaking connection to the story. The real Michelle Carter, the troubled young woman she'd been tracking for years believing her to be Emily, had died alone in a rehabilitation center. Hayes had used her as a decoy, knowing Margaret would follow the false trail while her real daughter lived just across town. In her hospital bed, Michelle fought against despair. The weight of what could have been growing up with Sarah, knowing her sister's love, being there for Melissa from the beginning, threatened to crush her spirit. The physical pain of her burns seemed minor compared to the ache of these lost possibilities. But I should have known, she whispered one night as Margaret held her hand. Somehow I should have felt her presence, recognized her when she treated me at the hospital. But even in the depths of their collective grief, small moments of grace appeared. A butterfly would land on the hospital windowsill, staying for hours as if standing guard. Melissa would find ways to make Michelle smile despite her pain. And gradually they began to understand that healing would come not from dwelling on what was lost, but from cherishing what remained. The weight of guilt finally broke Margaret one rainy evening in Michelle's hospital room. She had been organizing the get well cards when a photograph slipped from between them, an old image of Sarah at St. Mary's orphanage, clearly recognizable despite her youth, kneeling beside a small girl who could only be Michelle. "I found this years ago," Margaret confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "In Sarah's office after she died. I thought it was just another photo of her charitable work, but something about it bothered me. The little girl's eyes. They were so familiar. I buried it in a drawer, tried to forget about it." Michelle reached for her mother's trembling hand, her own movements still painful from the burns. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. But Margaret pulled away, pacing the small room. "You don't understand. I was so focused on finding my Emily, so consumed by my own loss, that I ignored the signs right in front of me. The birthmark, your eyes, your connection with Melissa, it was all there." She sank into the chair beside Michelle's bed, tears flowing freely now. "I let my fear and suspicion poison everything. Instead of seeing the blessing you were, I treated you like a threat. She choked on the words, "I even tried to convince James to let you go." But the confession hung heavy in the air between them. Outside, thunder rolled across the Austin sky, matching the storm of emotions in the room. "There's more," Margaret continued, forcing herself to meet Michelle's gaze. "When Hayes started sending those threatening letters, I hid some of them, the ones that hinted at your true identity. I was afraid if everyone knew the truth, I'd lose my place in the family. My selfishness could have cost you your life." Michelle struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain but determined to reach her mother. "But when it mattered most, when the fire came, you tried to reach us. You were ready to run into the flames." "Too late," Margaret whispered. "Always too late. Just like with Emily, the real Emily. I was too late to see her struggles, too late to help her. And then with you, I nearly made the same mistake again." The monitor beside Michelle's bed beeped steadily, marking the seconds of silence that followed. Finally, Michelle spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "When I was little at St. Mary's, I used to watch the other children leave with their new families. I'd tell myself their parents must have had a good reason for giving them up, that maybe they were looking for them all along. It helped me sleep at night." She reached again for Margaret's hand, and this time her mother didn't pull away. "Now I know I was right. You were looking for me, Mom. You never stopped looking. You just didn't know what you were seeing." Margaret broke down completely then, decades of guilt and grief pouring out. She told Michelle everything about her suspicions of the car-washing girl, her late-night internet searches trying to find dirt on her, her whispered warnings to James. "The day of the fire," she said between sobs, "when I saw you carry Melissa through those flames, I finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell me all along. Love isn't about blood or background or social status. It's about choice. Every day you chose to love Melissa, to protect her, to be there for her just like Sarah would have done. Michelle pulled her mother closer, ignoring the pain that shot through her burned skin. And now we choose to forgive, to heal. To heal, to be the family we were always meant to be. As they held each other, the storm outside began to ease. A shaft of evening sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the room. On the windowsill, 2 monarch butterflies appeared, their wings catching the light like stained glass. Margaret gasped softly. Sarah used to say butterflies were messages from guardian angels. But then maybe Michelle smiled through her tears. This is her way of saying we're finally on the right path. Together, mother and daughter watched the butterflies until they took flight, disappearing into the clearing sky. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, but now it felt less like the marking of pain and more like the beating of hearts finally in sync. As news of Hayes' crimes spread through Austin's elite social circles, the community that had once shunned Michelle now grappled with its collective guilt. Eleanor Patterson, who had led the Whisper campaign against Michelle, organized a town hall meeting at the local country club to address their prejudices and mistakes. "We pride ourselves on being pillars of society," Eleanor began, her usual aristocratic polish cracking with emotion, "yet we failed to see the true criminal in our midst while persecuting an innocent young woman who only showed love and courage." The room was packed with familiar faces, parents from Melissa's school, garden club members, charity board directors. Many had tears in their eyes as Detective Martinez presented evidence of how their own biases had helped Hayes maintain his deceptions for so long. "Your social ostracism of Michelle played right into Hayes' hands," Martinez explained. "He counted on your prejudices, your assumptions about class and background. It allowed him to continue separating families while hiding in plain sight among you." Barbara Mitchell, who had been particularly vocal in opposing Michelle's presence at school functions, stood up shakily. "I kept my children from playing with Melissa because of Michelle," she confessed. "Now my daughter cries every night, asking if she's the reason her friend was hurt in the fire." The community's response transformed from guilt to action. A fund was established for the other families Hayes had separated. The hospital wing where Michelle recovered was flooded with flowers, cards, and visitors. Parents organized meal trains, ensuring James and Margaret could remain at Michelle's bedside. But most touching were the children's responses. Melissa's classmates created a massive butterfly garden mural for Michelle's hospital room, each paper butterfly containing a message of love and apology. "Thank you for saving our friend," they wrote. "We're sorry we believed the lies." Tommy Chen, whose mother had once forbidden him from attending Melissa's birthday party because of Michelle, arrived at the hospital with his entire Little League team. They performed a special cheer they had created for Michelle's recovery, their young voices echoing through the sterile hallways with messages of hope and healing. Even the local media, which had initially sensationalized the story, shifted its tone. The Austin Chronicle ran a powerful series titled Prejudice and Redemption: The Michelle Carter Story, examining how social bias had enabled Hayes' crimes while celebrating Michelle's extraordinary courage and forgiveness. During one particularly meaningful afternoon, the Garden Club arrived en masse at the hospital. Led by Eleanor, they presented Michelle with architectural plans for a new butterfly sanctuary to be built in the renovated Wilson Garden. "We want to honor both you and Sarah," Eleanor explained, her voice trembling. "Two sisters who taught us the true meaning of love and sacrifice." The sanctuary would feature educational plaques about Hayes' crimes and the families he had separated, ensuring their stories would never be forgotten. A special section would be dedicated to Sarah's work with orphaned children, featuring her favorite quote, "Every butterfly was once a caterpillar. Change is always possible." Local businesses joined the effort. The community college, where Michelle had been taking night classes, offered her a full scholarship to complete her psychology degree. The Children's Hospital, where Sarah had worked, created a fellowship in her name, dedicated to helping reunite separated families. But perhaps the most profound change was in the daily interactions. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Michelle now stopped to offer heartfelt apologies. Parents who had whispered behind their hands at school pickup now openly embraced Melissa and asked about Michelle's recovery. Through it all, Michelle maintained her characteristic grace. From her hospital bed, she accepted each apology with genuine forgiveness, understanding that healing needed to extend beyond her own family to the entire community. Sarah always believed in the power of second chances, she told a group of visiting Garden Club members. She gave them to her patients, and now I choose to give them to you. We all have the capacity to learn and grow. As Michelle's strength returned and her release date approached, the community prepared to welcome her home properly. The same social circles that had once excluded her now competed to host her homecoming celebration. But Michelle had a simpler request: a quiet gathering in Sarah's restored garden, surrounded by the butterflies that had guided her family back together. The DNA test results arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, though their impact would be anything but quiet. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the hospital's chief geneticist, requested a private meeting with James, Margaret, and Michelle in her office. Melissa waited outside with a child life specialist, drawing butterflies and trying not to worry. The results are conclusive, Dr. Thompson began, spreading several documents across her desk. Not only is Michelle definitively Sarah Winchester's sister, but we found something even more remarkable. She paused, making sure she had their full attention. The genetic markers also confirm that Margaret is Michelle's biological mother. The room fell silent. Margaret's hand found Michelle's, squeezing tightly. "But how?" James asked, voicing the question they all shared. "We knew about Sarah's connection, but this..." Dr. Thompson pulled up a complex chart on her computer screen. "We ran the tests multiple times to be certain. The genetic match is undeniable. This led us to dig deeper into hospital records from the time of Michelle's birth." She produced a yellowed hospital file. A baby girl was born to Margaret Reynolds at Austin General on May 15, 1996. The same night, a fire broke out in the hospital's nursery wing. In the chaos of evacuation, 2 babies were switched, whether accidentally or deliberately, we may never know. "Hayes," Michelle whispered, the pieces falling into place. "He was already working at the hospital then, wasn't he?" James nodded grimly. "He was on the board of directors. He would have had access to everything." Dr. Thompson continued, "The baby identified as Emily Reynolds was given to the Winchesters, who had lost their child in the nursery fire. That baby grew up as Sarah Winchester. Meanwhile, the real Emily Reynolds, Michelle, was placed in St. Mary's Orphanage." But Margaret stood abruptly, pacing the office. "So not only did Hayes separate sisters, he switched them at birth. Sarah wasn't just Michelle's sister, she was her aunt." "Yes," Dr. Thompson confirmed. "Sarah was actually the daughter of Margaret's cousin, Janet Winchester, who died in childbirth that same night. Hayes used the nursery fire to cover his first manipulation of records, beginning a pattern that would continue for decades." The implications staggered them. Sarah had spent her life searching for her sister, not knowing she was actually searching for her cousin. Michelle had been right under her mother's nose the entire time, while Margaret chased leads about the wrong Emily. "There's more," Dr. Thompson said softly. "We found Sarah's private medical records. She discovered she was pregnant again just before her death. She never had the chance to tell anyone." James sank into his chair, overwhelmed. "A second child?" "She was in the early stages," Dr. Thompson explained. "She had just confirmed it the day of the accident. The appointment card was still in her purse when she trailed off, seeing the pain on James's face." Michelle stood shakily, moving to embrace James. "She wanted to give Melissa a sibling," she said softly. "Just like she never stopped wanting to find me." Margaret joined them, completing their circle. "She did find you," she said firmly. "Maybe not in the way she expected, but she led you to us, to your real family." Dr. Thompson quietly excused herself, leaving them to process the revelation. Through the office window, they could see Melissa still drawing, unaware that her family tree had just become even more intricate and meaningful. "How do we tell her?" Michelle asked, watching her niece, her cousin, create another butterfly. "With love," Margaret answered. "The same way Sarah would have. The same way you've done everything since you came into our lives." James picked up the DNA results, staring at the scientific proof of what their hearts had already known. Sarah used to say that families are born from love, not just blood. She never knew how right she was. As they left the office to collect Melissa, a fresh breeze carried the scent of roses from the hospital garden. A single monarch butterfly danced in the sunlight, its wings catching the light just as Sarah's hair used to do. Detective Martinez sat across from Robert Hayes in the prison interview room, a thick file of evidence spread between them. Hayes had finally agreed to tell the whole story, his once proud demeanor now reduced to a shell of bitter resignation. "It started with the hospital fire," Hayes began, his voice hollow. "I was embezzling from the hospital's children's wing fund. Sarah Winchester's mother was getting close to discovering the missing money. The fire was meant to destroy the records, but then I saw an opportunity in the chaos." He described how he'd deliberately switched the babies, creating a web of deception that would grow more complex over the years. "I needed to keep them apart. If they ever compared birth records, if they ever looked too closely at the hospital's finances from that night." Martinez pushed a photograph across the table. Sarah and Michelle, as children, unknowingly captured in the same frame at St. Mary's. "You orchestrated every separation, didn't you?" Hayes laughed bitterly. "It became an obsession, watching them live their separate lives, knowing I held the truth. When Sarah started working at the hospital, investigating missing children cases, I knew she'd eventually find something. She was too smart, too determined." "So you had her killed?" Martinez stated flatly. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way." Hayes slammed his fist on the table. "The driver was just supposed to scare her, make her back off. But he was drunk, lost control." He stopped, running trembling hands through his grey hair. "And Michelle? Why continue watching her after Sarah's death?" Hayes's eyes took on a fevered gleam. "She was my masterpiece, the orphan who grew up in plain sight of her real family. I made sure the Lockett incident happened just as potential adoptive parents were visiting. I kept Margaret following false leads about her daughter. It was perfect." He pulled out a worn notebook from his prison jumpsuit. "I kept records of everything. Every time they almost found each other, every near miss. Sarah treated Michelle's broken arm when she was 12. I was there, watching. Margaret used to buy flowers from the shop where Michelle worked weekends. They were so close so many times." Martinez recorded everything, each confession adding to the weight of Hayes's crimes. The notebook revealed decades of manipulation, fake documents, bribed officials, carefully orchestrated accidents that kept families apart. "But you made a mistake," Martinez pointed out. "You let James hire Michelle." Hayes's face contorted with rage. "Wilson, he ruined everything. He forced me out of the company when he found those missing funds. I lost my position, my reputation. When he hired Michelle, I thought it was perfect revenge. Let him get attached, then reveal her criminal past, watch his precious reputation crumble." "Except the criminal past was your creation," Martinez reminded him. "The fire was supposed to end it all," Hayes continued, ignoring her. "Destroy the evidence, the house, all of them. Instead, it revealed everything. Poetic, isn't it? Fire began my empire, and fire ended it." As Hayes spoke, James watched through the one-way glass, his hands clenched into fists. Beside him, Michelle stood silent, absorbing every word about the man who had shaped her life from the shadows. "I have one question," Michelle said suddenly, pressing the intercom button. "May I?" Martinez nodded, and Michelle's voice filled the interview room. "Why did you keep the evidence? The photos, the records? You could have destroyed everything. Why keep proof of your crimes? Hayes turned toward the mirror, seeming to look right at her, because someone needed to know, someone needed to appreciate the brilliance of it all. I created and destroyed families at will. I played God. No, Michelle replied firmly. You played with people's lives, but you didn't destroy anything. Love found a way. Sarah found me through Melissa. Margaret found me through fate. You didn't destroy our family, you just took the long way to bringing us together. Hayes slumped in his chair, decades of calculated control finally breaking. It was supposed to be perfect, he whispered. My revenge was supposed to be perfect. Martinez closed her notebook. Hayes' confession would help dozens of families discover the truth about their separated children. His detailed records would become a roadmap for healing, though the pain he'd caused could never be fully undone. The day after Hayes' confession, the Wilson family gathered in Michelle's hospital room to process everything they had learned. Melissa sat on the bed next to Michelle, carefully avoiding her aunt's bandages, while James and Margaret occupied the chairs beside them. So Mummy was looking for Aunt Michelle because she was really her cousin, Melissa asked, trying to understand the complex web of relationships, and Grandma Margaret is actually Aunt Michelle's real mum. Yes, sweetheart, James answered gently. Hayes made sure they couldn't find each other for a very long time, but somehow, love brought us all together anyway. Michelle reached for the two embroidered handkerchiefs, one with SW and one with EW, that now took on new meaning. Sarah wasn't just my sister in spirit, she said softly. She was my aunt, watching over me even when she didn't know why she felt so connected to that little girl at the orphanage. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. All those years I spent searching for Emily, my real daughter, was right here in Austin. Every time I drove past St. Mary's, every time I shopped where you worked, we were so close. Hayes kept detailed records of those near misses, James added, his voice tight with anger. He called them his masterpiece, all the times you almost found each other, the hospital visits, the chance encounters. But he didn't win, Melissa declared with childlike certainty. The butterflies brought us together, just like Mummy always said they would. Michelle smiled at her young cousin, marveling at how their relationship had only grown stronger with the revelation of their true connection. Your mom was right about so many things, Melissa. She used to tell her patients that families are built by love, not just blood. Now we know we have both. James pulled out an old photograph from his wallet. Sarah at the hospital, unknowingly treating a young Michelle for a broken arm. She felt it, you know. She wrote in her journal that day about a strange connection to a young patient, how the girl's eyes reminded her of someone. Her own Aunt Margaret finished. My cousin Janet's eyes. The same eyes I see now in Michelle. She moved to sit on the bed's edge, taking her daughter's hand. Hayes thought he was destroying families, but he actually gave us more family than we ever knew we had. The implications of Hayes' confession continued to ripple through their lives. Other families separated by his schemes were being reunited, each discovery bringing new waves of joy and healing to the community. What happens now? Melissa asked, voicing the question they all held. James looked around at his expanded family, his late wife's cousin who had become his daughter's protector, his former housekeeper who was now family in truth as well as spirit, and his precious daughter who had helped bring them all together. Now we heal, he said firmly. We build something new from all these broken pieces. Something Hayes never counted on a family stronger because of what we've overcome together. Michelle reached for her mother's hand, then James's, forming a circle with Melissa in the middle. Sarah used to say that butterflies emerge stronger after struggling out of their cocoons. Maybe that's what happened to us. All the struggle, all the pain. It made this moment possible. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. Sarah would have loved this, seeing her family not just reunited but expanded, knowing that her work with orphaned children somehow led us all back together. As they sat together, a warm breeze drifted through the hospital window, carrying the scent of the butterfly garden below. Two monarchs danced past the window, their wings catching the sunlight in a familiar way. Melissa gasped in delight. "Look, Mummy sent us a sign. She knows we're all together now." The adults smiled through their tears, each feeling Sarah's presence in that moment. She had started this journey, searching for her lost sister, never knowing she was actually searching for her cousin. But in the end, love had found its way home, creating a family bond stronger than any DNA test could measure. 6 months after the fire, the Wilson family stood in front of their rebuilt home. The mansion had been restored with subtle changes: a larger butterfly garden, a special memorial wing dedicated to Sarah, and most importantly, proper rooms for both Michelle and Margaret, acknowledging their permanent place in the family. "It's beautiful," Michelle whispered, her healed burns hidden beneath a long-sleeved blouse. The scars remained, but like everything else about their journey, they had become symbols of survival rather than suffering. The new butterfly sanctuary occupied what had once been Sarah's private garden. Now expanded, it featured educational plaques telling their family's story, becoming a place of healing for other separated families. Dozens of monarchs danced among the flowers, their wings catching the autumn sunlight. "Mummy would love it," Melissa declared, holding both Michelle's and Margaret's hands. The 7-year-old had grown wise beyond her years, understanding now that family could be both lost and found, broken and rebuilt. James unlocked the front door, then stepped back. "Michelle, Margaret, you should be the first to enter. This is your home now." Officially and legally, he handed them each a key, their names engraved in silver. Inside, the house felt different, warmer, more alive. Photos lined the walls, telling their complete story: Sarah as a child with her adoptive parents, Michelle at St. Mary's, Margaret with baby Emily, and newer images of their reunited family. Even Hayes's crimes had become part of their healing, displayed in a small museum section dedicated to preventing similar separations. Margaret paused before a particular photograph: Sarah treating young Michelle at the hospital. "She knew," she said softly. "Somewhere in her heart, Sarah knew you were family. That's why she never stopped searching." Michelle touched the bandage still covering her worst burn. "And now we honor her search by helping others. The Sarah Winchester Family Reunification Center has already helped 5 families find each other." The center, funded by James and supported by the community, had become their way of turning tragedy into triumph. They used Hayes's detailed records to trace other separated families, offering DNA testing, counseling and support through the reunion process. Melissa ran ahead to her room, calling them to follow. She had insisted on redecorating to include symbols of their expanded family photographs, mementos, and most importantly, a hand-painted family tree spreading across one wall, its branches filled with butterflies. "Look," she pointed proudly. "I added everyone. Mummy is here with angel wings, and Michelle and Grandma Margaret have special butterflies because they found their way home." James wrapped an arm around Michelle's shoulders, careful of her healing burns. "Sarah would be so proud of how you've helped Melissa understand all this. You've given her back the family she lost, and then some." Michelle leaned into his embrace, no longer the uncertain young woman who had first entered their lives. "We all helped each other heal. That's what family does." Margaret joined them, completing their circle. "Hayes thought he was writing a tragedy," she said, "but he actually wrote the first chapter of something beautiful. He brought us together in ways he never imagined." Through the window, they could see the butterfly sanctuary coming alive, with visitors, other families beginning their own journey of healing and reunion. The Sarah Winchester Foundation had become a beacon of hope, turning their personal pain into universal healing. "Ready to start this new chapter?" James asked, looking at his expanded family. Michelle smiled, taking Melissa's hand. "We already have. Every butterfly in that garden, every family we help reunite, every moment we share, it's all part of Sarah's legacy. She brought us together, even if not in the way she expected." Margaret touched the wall where Sarah's portrait hung. She always said everything happens for a reason. Maybe this was the reason, not just to reunite our family, but to help others find their way home too. As they stood together in their rebuilt home, surrounded by symbols of their journey, they felt Sarah's presence more strongly than ever. She lived on in Melissa's smile, in Michelle's courage, in Margaret's love, and in James's dedication to their shared mission. The sun set over Austin, casting long shadows through the butterfly garden. In the fading light, the monarchs seemed to glow, their wings carrying messages of hope to other families still searching for their way home. 1 year after the fire, the Wilson family hosted a special event at the Sarah Winchester Family Reunification Center. The facility, built adjacent to their restored home, had become a sanctuary for separated families, offering hope where once there had been only loss. Michelle stood at the podium, her burn scars now badges of honor rather than marks of trauma. The audience included dozens of families they'd helped reunite, community members who had become supporters, and even some of the nurses who had cared for her during recovery. Sarah Winchester spent her life searching for her sister Michelle began, her voice steady and strong. She never knew she was actually searching for her cousin, or that her search would eventually lead to the reunion of so many families, but that was Sarah always turning personal pain into universal healing. In the front row, Melissa sat between James and Margaret, wearing a dress decorated with butterflies. Now 8, she had become the center's youngest volunteer, helping other children understand their own complex family stories. Hayes thought he was writing a story of revenge. Michelle continued. He spent decades separating families, documenting every painful moment, but what he actually created was a roadmap back to each other. His detailed records have helped us reunite over 30 families this year alone. She gestured to the wall behind her, where photographs of reunited families created a mosaic of healing. Each of these stories began in pain, but they don't end there. They end in moments like this, moments of recognition, of understanding, of coming home. Margaret stepped forward then, joining her daughter at the podium. The woman who had once guarded her heart so fiercely now opened it daily to others experiencing similar pain. We've learned that family isn't just about blood or DNA tests. It's about the choices we make every day to love, to forgive, to heal together. James rose next, completing their family circle. The Sarah Winchester Foundation isn't just about reuniting separated families, he explained. It's about preventing these separations from happening again. Our advocacy has already led to stricter oversight of adoption agencies and new protocols for identifying trafficking attempts. Melissa tugged at Michelle's sleeve, whispering something that made her aunt smile. Michelle lifted the child to the microphone. "I want to tell you about butterflies," Melissa announced confidently. "My mom said they carry messages from angels. When you see one, it means someone loves you and is watching over you." The audience smiled, many wiping away tears. Among them sat Eleanor Patterson and other community members who had once judged Michelle so harshly. They had become the Foundation's strongest supporters, turning their social influence toward healing rather than division. "Today," Michelle resumed, "we're announcing the expansion of our services. The Hayes Records project will help track and identify other potential cases of family separation. We're also launching a scholarship program in Sarah's name for children who have been separated from their families." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand as Michelle revealed the final announcement. "And in honor of Sarah's work with orphan children, we're partnering with St. Mary's Orphanage to create a new family verification protocol. No child should ever have to wonder if their real family is out there searching for them." The butterfly sanctuary visible through the center's windows seemed to come alive with activity, dozens of monarchs taking flight simultaneously. The audience gasped at the display, and Melissa beamed. "See? Mummy's watching." As the ceremony concluded, families lingered to share their stories. Each one was different, yet connected by the same thread of loss and redemption that had brought the Wilsons together. "Sarah would have loved this," James said quietly, watching Michelle comfort a newly reunited mother and daughter. "She always said that healing happens in circles, not lines. Each person we help creates ripples that reach others." Margaret nodded, her eyes on Melissa as the child explained the butterfly garden to some visiting children. "And each generation learns to heal a little better than the last. Melissa understands things about family that took us decades to learn." Michelle joined them, wrapping an arm around each parent. Because she has all of us to teach her, Hayes tried to write a story of revenge and separation, but love wrote a different ending. Outside, the butterfly sanctuary flourished, each flower and wing a testament to Sarah's belief that beauty could emerge from any darkness. The Wilson family had not only found their way back to each other, they had created a path for others to do the same. On Sarah's birthday, 5 years after the fire, the Wilson family gathered in the butterfly sanctuary for a private celebration. The garden had matured beautifully, its flowers creating waves of color beneath the Texas sky. Michelle, now a licensed child psychologist, sat with Melissa on their favorite bench, while James and Margaret arranged a small birthday cake on a nearby table. "Tell me about Mom again," 12-year-old Melissa requested, her head resting on Michelle's shoulder. Though she'd heard the stories countless times, each telling seemed to reveal new layers of understanding. "Your mom was a healer," Michelle began, touching the faded burn scars on her arms. "Not just as a doctor, but in everything she did. She never knew she was my aunt, but she helped me anyway. That day in the hospital when I had a broken arm, she told me stories about butterflies until I forgot to be scared." James lit the candles on the cake, one for each year they'd been without Sarah, and one for each year they'd been together as a reunited family. "She would be so proud of what we've built here," he said, watching another group of families tour the sanctuary. The Sarah Winchester Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams. Their work had led to national legislation on adoption transparency, and their methods for family reunification had become a model studied worldwide. Hayes's detailed records, ironically, had become the key to healing hundreds of separated families. Margaret adjusted the fresh flowers by Sarah's memorial plaque. "Sometimes I think she knew, somehow, the way she kept searching, the way she built this garden. She was preparing the way for all of this." Michelle nodded, remembering the DNA test that had revealed their true relationship. She was looking for her sister but found so much more. She created a legacy of healing that's bigger than any of us. Melissa stood suddenly, pointing to a particular monarch butterfly that had landed on Sarah's plaque. Its wings were uniquely marked with patterns they'd come to recognize over the years. "Look, Hope is back." They'd named this special butterfly Hope after first spotting it the day Michelle came home from the hospital. It appeared during significant moments, as if Sarah was indeed sending messages through her beloved butterflies. The foundation approved 10 new cases today, James announced, his eyes twinning with pride. 10 more families will find their way back to each other. Michelle touched her aunt's name on the plaque. "Every reunion is part of your legacy, Sarah. Every family we help find each other. Every child who discovers their truth, it all started with your search for me." Margaret wrapped her arms around her daughter, no longer the suspicious housekeeper, but a fierce advocate for separated families. "And now we're the ones helping others search. Full circle, just as Sarah would have wanted." As they sang happy birthday and cut the cake, Hope remained perched on Sarah's plaque, wings gently opening and closing. The garden filled with the golden light of sunset, creating halos around the flowering bushes Sarah had planted so long ago. "I had a dream about Mom last night," Melissa shared, accepting a piece of cake. "She was in this garden, but it was huge, like it went on forever. She was showing other people the way home, just like we do." James smiled, recognizing the wisdom in his daughter's words. "That's exactly what we're doing, sweetheart. Using Sarah's love as a compass to help others find their way home." Michelle looked around at her family, her cousin, who had become like a daughter, her aunt's husband, who had given her a chance when others wouldn't, her mother, who had searched so long to find her. Hayes had tried to write them a tragedy, but love had written a different story. To Sarah, Michelle raised her glass in toast. Who taught us that family isn't just about DNA or destiny, it's about the choice to love, to forgive, to heal together? To Sarah they echoed, as hope took flight, circling once above them before soaring into the evening sky. The garden continued to bloom, each flower a testament to Sarah's belief that beauty could grow from any darkness. The Wilson family had not only found their way back to each other, they had created a path for others to do the same, turning one woman's search for her sister into a legacy of healing that would touch generations to come. If this story of family, redemption, and unconditional love has touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Has your family experienced a journey of healing and reunion? Share your story with our community. Please support our storytelling team by subscribing to the channel, giving this video a thumbs up, and sharing it with loved ones who might need to hear this message of hope. Together, we can spread stories that remind us of the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life.